Thank you everyone for attending our classical HCU externally led patient-focused drug development prep meeting in preparation for our meeting later next month. I want to thank you guys for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us this afternoon, evening, depending on where you are, to learn more about this very important meeting and to learn why your involvement is needed. So first we'll figure out what is a EL-PFDD. So the externally led patient-focused drug development meeting, as we've been referring to as an EL-PFDD, I'm sure you guys are very familiar with that now, thanks to all our social media posts, but it is a meeting, it's an exciting opportunity to inform the US and Food Drug Administration, otherwise known as the FDA, and other key stakeholders, such as companies and researchers, about the patient perspective of what it means to live with HCU. It is a very important one-time opportunity to share our stories of ours and our loved ones who live with this condition, with people who ultimately can make radical change in our lives. It doesn't matter where you live. We have patients that will be participating quite literally from all around the globe. What matters is your story. And so we really need everyone's participation. The primary goal is to hear directly from both patients and caregivers about their perspectives on living with HCU and their experiences with treatments. Even if your child is an adult, caregivers, we need your experiences too, because the patient experience is different from the caregiver experience. So please keep that in mind. And our outcome is to improve the development of new drugs in the research pipeline and inform the context in which regulatory decisions will be made for new drugs for HCU. And we'll explain that a little bit more here as we go. But before we get too far in, we would like to stop and thank our sponsors and supporters. This meeting would not be able to be done, at least as easily, without them. So thank you to all these organizations and companies listed on this slide. So today's webinar is scheduled to last approximately 1 hour. You are muted by default. We cannot hear you. So again, if you do have questions throughout, please post them in the Q&A. At the end of the meeting, we will address these questions, and and if you would like to come off mute, we'll be able to raise your hand then, and we can unmute you if you feel comfortable. This webinar is recorded and available for later viewing on our EL-PFDD webpage listed here. To ask questions during the webinar, please use the Q&A button, which we've already discussed. And again, we will address these at the end. So what is the purpose of this meeting? It is to educate the FDA and other stakeholders, those companies that we talked about and researchers, on what it's like to live with HCU, how has it impacted our lives, how you currently are managing. Everyone's treatments are just a little bit different, and so are their symptoms, and what a meaningful treatment would look like to you. Not all of us want the exact same thing, so it's important we hear from each and every one of you. Why should I participate? Because we're each unique. We actually need to hear from everyone. This is an opportunity to have our voices heard. And the FDA approves all treatments for HCU and needs to know what is important to each of us. This knowledge will impact their decision-making and leads to better treatments and potentially faster approvals for the treatment of HCU. So why now? The patient voice has been historically absent from the drug development process. If you look back 10, 20 years ago, patients were missing from the narrative. And so they didn't really historically approach patients until clinical trials were failing and drug companies were wondering what was going on. And so they wanted actual input at that point. And then until a drug was approved or the clinical trial, so drug or the clinical trial was failing. So rather than wait till we're in a failing state, now they have decided to put that in the beginning stages of the process and incorporate it throughout. And so the stakeholder engagement is a priority of the FDA. And so they now offer these meetings. We initiated this meeting with the FDA so they can learn about what it means to live with the disease from both the patient and caregiver perspective. All right, and at this time, I am going to introduce James and Larry, who you see here with me. Larry and James are from Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara, who I've gotten to know over the past several months, actually the past year as we've been planning this meeting. James has worked the last 13 years as a champion for the patient voice as part of the regulatory process. And James previously worked at the FDA. He was a patient liaison helping to incorporate the patient voice into medical product review across the FDA's various medical product centers and review divisions. There are numerous. There, he helped to develop and launch the patient-focused drug development initiative. So he is a pioneer in this process. And Larry worked at the NIH for 17 years in clinical research, followed by a position at the FDA as a regulatory scientist in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research Rare Disease Program. I'm glad I don't typically have to say that all like written out. And so, but that is the group that co-founded, that he co-founded and worked for 10 years, where he advanced rare disease drug development. In private practice, James and Larry have worked with many patient organizations. I think we're about their 80th, to ensure their community voices are heard in the decision-making process. Whoops. Relevant to our EL-PFDD meeting, they have been involved in many of these meetings and have weighed in tremendously with the FDA. So we are in good hands with James and Larry, and we are so excited to be this far along and to take this to the next step in our community. So thank you everyone for being here, and thank you, James and Larry.
Yeah, well, thank you, Nay, for that introduction. And it's such a pleasure to be here with everyone in this HCU community as you're here to learn a little bit more about this externally led patient-focused drug development meeting. Maybe you pre-registered, you're trying to learn more so you can be more prepared. Maybe you're here because you want to learn what this is all about and make a decision of whether to attend. Either way, this webinar is for you, and hopefully you'll walk away excited to participate in this meeting. So today, Larry and I are going to just give you some information. We'll start with giving you some background on FDA and drug development. Some of you may have some experience in the space. We want to make sure everyone understands, what is it that we're trying to really help inform by bringing your voices to the table. We'll then actually go into that and talk about how your voices as patients and caregivers do impact that process, and specifically how this EL-PFDD meeting is designed to do that, and all of the ways that you can participate. So by the end, we'll have gotten into the nitty-gritty details and the logistical information that you might want to know. So I'm going to get us started on that first topic, which is really giving you an overview on FDA and the process of drug development. And we're going to start talking about how drugs do get developed and the different stages of drug development. And that really starts before a drug is even being studied. It's when we're trying to discover new drugs. And so a lot of the times you might hear about R&D, which stands for research and development. So this is kind of the research stage of R&D. And so researchers in academia, at NIH, different places are looking and investigating diseases, trying to understand where in a disease process, might there be an opportunity to try to stop the disease, reverse the disease process. And once that kind of understanding of the disease, comes to light, then we can start to think about, well, what opportunities, what drug compounds or biologics like cell or gene therapies could there be that might help actually do those things, stop or reverse a disease process. And so either, those researchers can identify existing treatments, maybe treatments that are even approved for other uses, and repurpose those products for a condition, or maybe a new product is invented or developed. And this could be through a new technology that allows us to be maybe more targeted in addressing a disease. So it's really that only once we actually find that promising compound that the researchers can kind of begin to take the product into development. And that's what we're going to talk about now, are those stages of development. And you can see those across the bottom of this slide here, starting with what I'm going to talk about first, which is preclinical development. But then you'll see phases 1, 2, and 3, which are of clinical development. And then the actual FDA review of all of that data and potential access to that product on the market. So starting with preclinical development, we're taking that promising compound and we want to, have some assurance that it's both safe and it has, an effect that we think it has before we go and start testing in humans. And so that's why we call it preclinical, just means before going into the clinic or before going into humans. And so here, those goals really are that we want to make sure it's reasonably safe. We assess that by doing what are called toxicology studies. And then we start to see, if the, compound has the effect that we think it has, either in different chemical assay tests or maybe even animal models of a disease or condition. And when we do that, we can kind of develop some early evidence that the drug is going to do what we think. And we can use both those toxicology studies as well as those, animal model studies to help us understand, what dose or doses make sense to take into the clinic, into humans, both in terms of safe starting doses that we maybe can start to escalate up to higher doses, as well as active doses. We don't want, to take drugs into people that we don't think actually will have that activity and work. So once these studies are done, these preclinical studies, all of that is put together in a particular type of application to FDA called an investigational new drug application, or IND for short. That IND puts together those the pharmacology and toxicology studies. Those are those preclinical studies we were just talking about, but also other information. It includes manufacturing information, because not only do we want to have information about how safe and effective the drug might be, but we also want to make sure drugs are high quality. We want to make sure that the way that they're produced, they're consistently produced. So you're getting the right amount of, the active ingredient. You don't want to get overdosed. You don't want to be underdosed. We also want to make sure that there aren't impurities that might be harmful to people who take the drugs. And so that information is included as well as the proposal for the first in human clinical trial. And that study plan is called a protocol. That's submitted along with the information that would be given to the investigator, as well as other things like the informed consent forms, are all provided to FDA in this IND. And FDA then reviews that and has to allow, a company or other sponsor of a clinical trial, the clearance to go into clinical trials. And that's an important role that FDA plays. They, of course, can also give input on the clinical trial design. And that's something FDA does throughout development. And so typically with new drugs, the first phase of development is called phase 1. And so phase 1 can be sometimes in healthy volunteers. In rare diseases, a lot of the times it can actually be directly in patients. And here, this is where we're really trying to, go into a small number of people, sometimes to start just with a single dose. And then once we get through those single dose studies, we'll start going to multiple doses. But they're not the long chronic studies. They're just for a short period of time. And by doing this, we can see what the most common side effects are and how serious those most common side effects are. In addition to that, we can actually see where the drug gets to in the body, how long it stays in, how it gets out, how it's excreted. And that is all helpful as well to help us understand, how the drug's working, if it's getting to the areas of the body that it needs to in people. Although at this stage, we're not really able to understand if the drug's working. It's just too short, too small of a study. But if we feel that there's a reasonable safety profile, we do look at multiple doses. We think we have some doses we can narrow down to. We then move into what's called phase 2 of clinical development. And so phase 2 studies give us an opportunity to start to increase the number of people in our study. Phase 2 studies are always in patients, never in healthy volunteers. We're starting to design the study to try to be able to detect how the drug's working. Now, phase 2 studies aren't typically the kind of what we sometimes refer to as like the pivotal or registrational study, the study that establishes effectiveness for regulatory purposes. But sometimes in rare diseases, it is possible that a phase 2 study is designed in a way that it actually, if successful, could be the basis of an FDA approval action. But stepping back, phase 2, we're starting to look at effectiveness. We look to see if the drug is working in people. So we're including endpoints. That's just the term for the different kind of things that we're looking at to judge whether the drug's working, and that could be measures of how patients are feeling, how they're functioning. It could be even survival. We might be looking at biomarkers, that like lab values, for example, or imaging. Looking at all of these things to start to see, are we seeing a signal? Are we seeing a positive trend that the drug is actually helping the patients in ways that are important to them? Here we might design a trial, with a control group, rather than it just being open label and everybody getting drug. We need to say, well, what was really the effect due to drug versus kind of the placebo effect. Placebos are, kind of one way to think about it is like the proverbial sugar pill. And so people don't know if they're taking the drug or they're taking the placebo. And so we can kind of those different endpoints aren't influenced or biased by people knowing whether they're on drug or not. We also, of course, even though we're starting to look at effectiveness here, are still very focused on safety. We can start to see some more of the short-term side effects and other safety issues. Once we now kind of know what doses have our best opportunity to show that the drug works, and again, assuming those same doses are also reasonably safe, we then can move into phase 3. And so phase 3, this is the penultimate stage. These are the longest, largest trials. These are most typically placebo-controlled, but not always. But it is important to have some type of control group, again, to be able to distinguish what would normally happen to a person living with the disease versus what happens when the drug maybe is helping them. So because these studies are larger and longer, we can start to see if the drug not only works initially, but does it continue to work over time, which is really important in chronic conditions. Because they're larger, we can start to look at subgroups. How does the drug affect men versus women, or people at different ages, or maybe people with different severity of disease coming into the study. And we may be able to continue looking at different doses if we are studying more than one dose at this stage. Also, because these are the largest and longest studies, these are really helpful in terms of understanding safety. We can be, really look to see, what the longer term safety side effects are. We might be able to start to detect how certain safety events are more likely in certain people, again, subpopulations. So we're really here kind of building the penultimate, safety and efficacy story for a drug, because once we finish phase 3, which could be 1 or 2 phase 3 studies, then what we want to do, or companies developing drugs want to do, is go and talk to FDA to talk about whether a new drug application, that's for small molecule drugs, or a biologics license application for biologics like enzyme replacements or cell and gene therapies, whether a marketing application, whether an NDA or BLA is appropriate. And so this is done through what's called a pre-NDA meeting, where the pivotal studies are identified. The different methods for analyzing the data from those studies is discussed, including the top line data. And the idea here is to see if there's any gaps or major unresolved issues, because, you know, it's in nobody's interest to have an NDA or BLA be submitted for FDA review if there's a big gap that would preclude FDA from being able to approve the drug. So sometimes a pre-NDA meeting or other meeting will happen, and there'll actually be something identified that additionally needs to be done before the company could come in with that marketing application. When it does happen, that NDA or BLA submitted, it includes everything that we've talked about, all of the preclinical information, all of the phase 1, 2, and 3 studies. So all of that is put together into a very large submission that goes to FDA to then review. So as part of FDA review, this application, it comes in, they first have to make sure that it's complete. So they do this filing review. They say, okay, are we actually going to file this application? Is it complete? And they assign a review team to help them evaluate the application. FDA's, once they do file and start their review, they're going to look at a lot of the same things we've been talking about, but with the lens of, you know, is this drug safe and effective and high enough quality to go onto the market? And so we're looking at the drug's effectiveness, we're looking at the safety. Safety is not, there's no universal safety, you know, it's safety is relative to the benefits, you know, so that's why we say that the benefits have to outweigh the risks. And we'll talk, that's actually a really important decision that's made where the patient voice is really, really important. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And I talked about manufacturing earlier. That becomes even more important here because now manufacturing is being scaled up. So that way there's enough drug being produced that it can supply, you know, everybody that might take it, you know, out in the real world. When FDA is doing their review, you may have heard news about FDA advisory committees. FDA has the option to take a application to an advisory committee to get external input. And so this group is advisory. It's made up of clinicians, other scientists, and also patient representatives who are presented the data, both from the company and from the FDA points of view. And then they're asked to weigh in on different questions to either discuss or vote on. Ultimately, again, this is advisory. FDA still makes the decision, ultimate approval decision, but this can be really helpful. And these are usually pretty high profile, and there's an opportunity at these meetings for the public to come during the open public hearing and present their views. So that's an important place where the patient community would be able to come and be heard. So ultimately, if FDA approves a drug, the job doesn't stop there. There is post-market surveillance that goes on, primarily focused on drug safety. We know that when a drug gets approved, it's only been studied in a small, section of the patient population that might, be out there looking to use the drug. Clinical trial inclusion, exclusion criteria may limit people who are on certain drugs, have certain comorbidities, maybe are certain ages. But then out in the real world, those people may have access to the drug. And so we want to make sure that we're understanding the real safety profile of the drug, in that broader population. And so that safety information is tracked and reported to FDA. And FDA ultimately has to continue to make sure that the benefits of a drug continue to outweigh the risks of it. So now that we've talked a little bit about how drugs kind of go through that R&D process, let's talk a little bit more about FDA's role, because it's not just at the beginning, at that IND, that investigational new drug application, and at the end with that, marketing application. FDA plays a more of a role than that, and we kind of want to talk about where they are involved, as well as importantly where they aren't involved. So as we think about those the drugs being developed in those clinical trials, it's important to know that FDA is not the one developing those drugs. That is being done by researchers, pharmaceutical companies, sometimes even nonprofit groups step in and play that role. And similarly, FDA is not doing any testing of these drugs, whether in clinical trials. They're not running the trials. Their staff aren't on site during trials. It's researchers that are the ones conducting the trials. And they have to, like we talked about, seek FDA approval before beginning. Once drugs, are on the market approved by FDA, there's a couple of things that are important to know, which is that first, FDA doesn't have the authority to regulate the practice of medicine. So they don't regulate how doctors prescribe these medicines to their patients. FDA is only regulating how drugs are developed and how the companies that then manufacture the approved drugs, how they can go about marketing those products, whether to doctors or to the public. So what that means is doctors are free to prescribe FDA-approved drugs for other conditions, and this is commonly referred to as off-label use of drugs. So when we're thinking about FDA, they're thinking about approving for a certain use. Doctors are free to use their judgment based off of medical research and literature and practice experience to do other prescribing beyond that. Along the same lines, FDA also doesn't regulate the price of medicine or whether or not insurance companies, whether government or private, are going to cover a medicine. So it's FDA, they're weighing the direct benefits and risks of a drug. They're not considering what the drug price will be. They don't have that information. Even if they did legally, they can't consider that as part of their decision making. So kind of issues around cost and access are outside of the scope of the patient-focused drug development meeting because the FDA is not involved. Similarly, issues of how doctors use products that are on the market or otherwise kind of how the healthcare system operates are outside of the scope of this meeting. I've now spent a couple of slides talking about what FDA doesn't do, but let's talk a little bit more about what FDA does actually do. So they're not just there to protect the public health, but they're there to promote the public health. And you can imagine these FDA reviewers, they see every clinical trial, proposal, the results, what works, what doesn't work. So they have a lot of expertise and knowledge from, all of the things that they see that can help and be a resource to researchers and drug developers. And so FDA does make that available, and they provide technical advice through meetings that actually can happen throughout those stages of drug development, before that IND, so before clinical trials, and then, throughout all of those stages of clinical development. And so FDA gives advice to companies on how to design, what they think would be appropriate designs for trials. And again, this happens through a whole series of meetings that occur over the course of a drug being developed as new data comes out of those earlier stage studies to then help inform and design the next stage studies. I've covered all of this at a very high level and pretty quickly. If you want to learn more about how FDA regulates medical products, and then even just more generally ways that patient stakeholders can get involved with an FDA. FDA has a great resource set of web pages designed for patients and caregivers. So I listed out that website on this slide, so you can feel free to dig in and learn more. But at this stage, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Larry Bauer, who's now going to talk a little bit more about where your voices as patient and caregivers fit into that process.
Thank you so much, James, for that great overview of the drug development process. And like James said, now I'm going to really focus in more about our specific meeting for HCU. Next slide. So once again, just to review what the purpose of our meeting is, the FDA wanted to really develop a more systematic way to gather patients and caregivers' perspectives about different conditions and the available treatment options that were out there for them. This kind of a meeting really helps to inform the FDA's understanding of the benefit risk assessment that they do and decisions for making and approving new drugs. Patient input really helps the FDA during drug development and at their review of an application for marketing a new drug. So at the beginning of the process, like James said, in the early phase 1, when they're developing a clinical trial for a new product, they'd like to hear about patient and caregiver experience there, all the way to the end of the process where, they're trying to review all the data from a new drug. Next slide. So just a minute ago, I mentioned something called a benefit risk assessment. So every time a new drug is developed, the company sends all that information to the FDA to review all the results of clinical trials, and it's the FDA's responsibility to evaluate all of that data. They want to evaluate what were the benefits that were seen in the clinical trial, so how did it help people with that condition, and then what are the risks, so what were the safety signals that emerged, and how severe were those safety signals? And then they have to eventually make a decision. Do the benefits of this new treatment outweigh the risks, the potential risks of it? And this goes into their decision whether to approve the drug or not. You know, FDA does not always approve new drugs that are submitted to them. They go through this very formal step-by-step process. The first two areas on this list are the analysis of the condition. So they need to understand what is the disease that the drug was being developed for. You know, what are the symptoms of the disease? And then they also want to understand what are current treatment options available. So are there a lot of things already available? And how effective are those things? Or for some, especially for some rare diseases, there's never been an FDA-approved treatment before. It's these first two things that our EL-PFDD meeting is really going to help the FDA with, to understand about HCU. The last three things here, the benefit and the risk analysis, that comes from the clinical trial data. Okay, next slide. So our HCU EL-PFDD meeting, it's a framework for, we developed a framework of discussion questions that were actually borrowed from the FDA's benefit risk framework, and it represents important considerations in their decision-making. So we reviewed other PFDD meetings the FDA had, other disease area questions, and we tailored our agenda for this meeting and the panel questions to try to communicate the most important information that we think the FDA needs to learn about HCU. And FDA we've been meeting with them on a monthly basis. They've been supporting us through this process, and they've really emphasized to us that active patient involvement and participation is the key to the success of these meetings. And that's why we're meeting with you today, to try to get you excited about the meeting. Next slide. One of the outcomes of the meeting is something called the Voice of the Patient report. So we will prepare a written document after the meeting is finished. This document is going to be a summary of all the patient and caregiver and audience testimony, the polling data that we do, the live polling on your telephone, as well as any submitted written comments that come in. This document is a key communication to the FDA review staff, as well as to drug companies and drug developers about what's the most important things for a new treatment for patients and caregivers of people, you know, that have HCU. And FDA really wants this information. It informs them about ways that meaningful treatments for HCU can be developed. This Voice of the Patient report is publicly available, and Danae will post it on their website, so anybody after the meeting's finished can come back and read the report of the meeting. Next slide. So now, how can you participate in the meeting? Okay, let's go over all these different logistics. So who is the meeting for? It's for HCU patients and caregivers. We hope as many FDA staff are going to attend as possible. It's for people from the pharmaceutical and biotech companies and anyone interested in learning more about HCU. You can invite, it's a public meeting, so you can invite family, friends, anyone, you know, people you work with, anyone, you know, that might want to learn more about HCU. It'll take place on October 27th, so just weeks from now. It'll be 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and the meeting will be virtual, so people can attend from California to New York to London to Africa to wherever people want to tune in from. And then how will they do this? If you go to the EL-PFDD website that is in the link here, and if you go to HCU America's website, you'll see links to how to register, and then on the day of the meeting, how to join the meeting. Next slide. So just to go over what will the day of the meeting look like. we'll start off with welcoming everybody and have introductory comments from HCU America as well as from the FDA. We'll have a representative from the FDA speaking. Then we've invited a clinician to come and give a background about HCU. This is someone who's got expert knowledge. The purpose of this talk is so that everybody listening has at least a basic understanding of, scientific background about HCU. And this will be a great way to lead us off into the discussion that follows. After we have this clinical presentation, the rest of the day will be spent listening to and learning from people that live with HCU and their caregivers. The day is divided into two major topics. In the morning, we'll talk about HCU symptoms. So what kind of symptoms do people experience and how do those symptoms affect your life? In the afternoon, we're going to switch gears a little bit and we'll talk about how do you manage those symptoms. So what kind of treatments maybe are you using? This could include any kind of a medical treatment or drug or a medical food, as well as other things you do. Some people might use things like acupuncture or meditation or dietary changes or exercise, anything that you do to try to alleviate the symptoms of living with HCU. The way we'll do these two topics, we'll have pre-recorded patient panels for each topic. And then we'll include polling questions and a moderated discussion with the audience, you. So these, the pre-recorded panels, these are people that have been working on developing statements about living with HCU. We'll hear from 5 people in the morning, 5 people in the afternoon. And the polling you'll do on your cell phone. There'll be instructions on the top of your screen about how to log in on your phone, the URL, and the polling will happen in real time. Just FYI, the polling is only for people living with HCU and their caregivers. We don't want to hear from industry. We don't want to hear about, from doctors and nurses and things like that. It's just to, to focus on people living with HCU. And after this, we'll have a summary of the day and then some closing comments to end the day at 3 o'clock. Next slide. So just to give you an idea about what some of the discussion questions that you'll be hearing on the day of the meeting, for the topic 1, where we're focusing on symptoms and impacts, some of the things we'll ask are like, of all the symptoms of HCU, which 1 to 3 symptoms have the most significant impact on you or your loved one's life? How does HCU affect you or your loved one on your best and your worst days? Describe your best and worst days. And are there specific activities that are important to you that you or your loved one cannot do at all or as fully as you would like because of HCU? Next slide. Also, how have you or your loved one's symptoms changed over time? And how has the ability to cope with the symptoms changed over time? We want to understand the physical aspects of living with HCU, as well as some of the psychological and emotional impacts. And then what do you fear as you get older or as your loved one gets older? So what worries you the most about their condition or what frustrates you the most about their condition? Next slide. Then in the afternoon, we'll take a half-hour break for lunch. In the afternoon, we're going to start talking about treatments for HCU. Some of the questions we'll talk about are, what are you currently doing to manage HCU symptoms? And we want to know, how well do these treatments treat the most significant symptoms of HCU? Are they working? Are they not working? Also, what are the most significant downsides to your current treatments and how do they affect you or your loved one's daily life? So, are there side effects that you experience from anything that you're doing? And how does that impact you? And then finally, we'd also like to know, of course, everybody would like, if they could find a complete cure for HCU, that would be fantastic. But if they don't find a cure and they develop a new drug or treatment, what specific things would you look for in an ideal new treatment for HCU? So what symptoms would be most important that you would like to be to have treatment for? Maybe it's a different route of administration or a different way of taking a drug. We'd like to hear all about what your thoughts are and your hopes for the future. Next slide. So the discussion format, as I mentioned earlier, there'll be a panel of patients and caregivers for each of the topics. The purpose of these panels it's to set the foundation for the broader audience discussion that'll follow. The panelists were selected to reflect a range of experiences with HCU. Then after we hear from the panelists, the patients and caregivers in the audience and online will have a chance to answer the polling questions using their telephone. Once again, these polling questions, the purpose of them is to have a starting off point for more live discussion. You use your cell phone, tablet, or computer to respond. And after we do some of the polling, the discussion will move to the audience. And the purpose then is to build on the experiences shared by the panel. So our moderator, who's going to be James, who you just heard from, will ask questions and invite you to submit responses in writing, or preferably to call in to provide live comments. So on the day of the meeting, at the top of your screen, when James asks for live comments, there'll be a telephone number. You just pick up your phone, call in, and there'll be an operator that'll take your call and ask you what it is that you wanted to share, and then you'll be put into a queue. While you're in the queue, you'll still be able to listen to the meeting. So if you call in, don't worry that you're going to miss anything. You'll still be able to hear the meeting. And then we'll try to get to as many telephone callers as possible on the day of the meeting. There's also, as it says here, the ability to write in comments. You can actually go to the HCU website and put in written comments now, even before the meeting, as well as on the day of the meeting, you can add additional comments. And then we're going to keep that comment line open for about 30 days after the meeting. Next. So just a few tips for how you can effectively participate in the meeting. Think back on what James shared about what FDA's role is and the purpose of the meeting. Take a look at these discussion questions in advance, or think about some of the things that I just listed as a discussion question. And if you've got something important to share, try to relate it to the most appropriate topic or panel question that we're focused on at that time, and then pick up your phone and call in. And know that it's okay to reiterate a feeling or experience already voiced by someone, even if it's similar to your own. But when you share your experience, try to give it a personal or unique perspective. Try to keep your comments concise and focused. There's many voices to be heard about this topic. And as I said earlier, you can always send in additional comments after the meeting. Next slide. So you participate in the meeting by the webcast. You can pre-register now at this website. And as I said, you can submit questions in advance or up to 30 days after the meeting. And know that these comments will be included in the Voice of the Patient report. Next slide. So this is your opportunity to be part of the process. Know that you can have a meaningful impact on clinical trial design and drug development for HCU. And your voices must be heard at the beginning of the process to help companies design trials for you, and to help the FDA in their risk and benefit assessment, and to really understand HCU. So please join the meeting and help make a difference. So at this point, we have about 15 minutes left for questions. Danae, would you mind sharing some of the questions that have come in?
Yes. So I'm going to kind of go through in chronological order of your presentation. I think that will just help me stay on track, because we actually have quite a few, and I had some additional ones that were sent to me directly. And so the first one is, I'm sure it changes based on the type of drug, but how long on average is the drug process? The person who submitted this comment said, I vaguely remember 10 years from our conference last summer. Does that sound about accurate?
Yeah, so it's one of those questions where the answer is always, it depends. But when we think about kind of maybe the average that's really going from, the beginning of that R&D process that I talked about all the way through to approval, 10 years is probably about right. Now, if we're talking about drugs that maybe are already approved, or even if they're not approved, have maybe been heavily studied in other diseases, and now it's being studied in maybe HCU, we don't have to start from the very beginning. So it might be a little bit more, expedited to do it that way. But just know generally for, rare serious diseases with unmet needs like HCU, FDA is very cognizant of that need, and has different programs and policies in place that help it apply its standards in a way that's appropriate for that context. And so maybe, like I was talking about, you might need, typically FDA would require 2 phase 3 studies. For a disease like this, FDA might say, well, we'll accept 1 study, if it's accompanied with some other evidence that's not a second phase 3 study, which could shave years off of what would be the normal process of what's needed.
And this is why it's so important, though, outside of the EL-PFDD, to be participating in a RareX HCU data collection program, and also the Travere-sponsored natural history study, and for if you're a cobalamin family, participating in this call, the NIH MMA study. So all these things can help accelerate the drug approval process because it's further evidence of the symptoms. And so all those things can be utilized, but we need patient data if we're going to move things along at a faster rate. So thank you. All right. So the next question we have here are, what are the potential drug treatments, and what are the potential HCU drug treatments in this this process currently? Do you want me to take that one? I would be happy to.
Yeah,
okay. So there's 2 things I'll say here. We actually have 2 sponsors that were listed on that slide, Synlogic and Travere. They both have clinical trials underway. Travere is currently in phase 2 for their Compose study, and Synlogic has completed phase 1, and hopefully will be moving to phase 2 here shortly. And so that is where we stand. There are some additional things that are in the pipeline, and if you join our EL-PFDD meeting on the 27th of October, our speaker, Margie Miglin, who speaks at our conferences, who is the chair of our research program, she will be giving a much more in-depth overview of the potential treatments that are in the pipeline. Okay. And the next question here, I believe this is one of our international families, and their question is, would clinical trials for drug development ever include people from countries outside of the US, Ireland, for example, or are clinical trials only ever conducted on patients in the country of the manufacturer?
Yeah. Another great question. So this really just depends on where the drug company wants to conduct their trials. So there's, typically for a drug that's going to be approved in the US, there will be, clinical trial sites in the United States, but it doesn't have to be only in the United States. And because it's hard to find people with rare diseases, a lot of the times, while there might be multiple sites in the US, there will also be sites in other countries. There are examples even of times where drugs are studied only outside of the US and they still get approved in the United States. So, so the question is, the answer to your question is yes, clinical trials can and often do include trial sites outside of the United States. It's going to depend on trial to trial. So you just have to look, go to the HCU network, go to places like clinicaltrials.gov, where they're going to list where all of the clinical trial sites are. And it might differ, might for a phase 2 study that's pretty small, be it just in one place. But then when it goes to phase 3, they might broaden it and include other sites. So it's important to keep an eye out for that.
Yes, we definitely do relay clinical trial information. So if you have not joined our mailing list, we do send out about a quarterly publication via email with research opportunities. That's not just for the US, that's also internationally as well. Most sponsors will have information about their drugs that they have in development on their website. And so you can go there and also learn where their clinical trial sites are at as well. If you find clinicaltrials.gov too overwhelming, although they've done a great job with their redo of and relaunch of their website. I have a couple more questions here, and I see we have a few more minutes. Let me see here. I know a question that we get pretty often, and I don't know if this is something you can speak to, is, patients are all very eager to join clinical trials, and under the pretense they think that they're stopping their current treatment. Typically, when patients enroll in a clinical trial, are they able to stop their treatment, or do they need to continue their current treatment regime, or does that depend on the clinical trial?
It does depend on the clinical trial, and it may, even within a clinical trial, depend from one treatment to the next. Like some treatments may be allowed to continue while others may need to, not be allowed. And sometimes being on a treatment, even if you stopped, you would be ineligible for a trial. It's a tricky thing. People designing trials are trying to minimize the number of variables that influence the outcomes, because the worst thing is to do a study and not feel confident that it's really answered the question of whether the investigational product, is, has an effect on the endpoints that you're measuring. So sometimes there is, requirement to stop, but a lot of the times when something's standard of care, that standard of care can be used both in the treatment group and in the placebo group. So placebo doesn't necessarily mean you're on nothing. It means you're on standard of care and you're adding placebo to that.
I think that's an important thing too, because I know some patients are completely, they're nervous to stop their standard of care too.
Yeah.
So at least you have that as your default. So
yeah, and I would say an important question to ask, obviously anytime you have questions like this, talk to the study doctors, they're called investigators, because they can answer all of your questions. And you can ask them questions like, even if I have to come off initially, am I allowed to go back on? Because it's not always the case that just because you have to come off, they can monitor. And if something is changing, something's not going well for you, health-wise, that they are allowed to put you back on. So it's a great question, and it depends on from study to study, from treatment to treatment within the study. But ask all of those questions to the study doctors, and they'll be able to help give you really good specifics.
okay, so we do have a couple more really good ones. All right, so one patient asked, and I think you kind of hinted at this already. She said, most clinical trials, you can only participate in one clinical trial at a time. Is there a guideline between trials before starting another, or can you only participate in one trial in your life and that's it?
So it usually can't be in more than one for products. Sometimes there's trials for that aren't for products. So it might be, something that a academic institution is running a trial to, do certain monitoring. And sometimes these are actually natural history studies, but usually you can only be in one trial for a investigational drug at a time. And again, it's study specific, but this is one where pretty much every study I've seen, makes it so you're ineligible if you're already in another trial. Now, whether or not you can have been in a trial and then go into another one, a lot of the times depends on what the other studies were for, and how long that impact, if even known, is expected to be. But there definitely are studies that allow you to enroll if you've had enough time to kind of wash out from the earlier drug, investigational drug, before being able to start, the new drug.
Thank you. And that's exactly what I was thinking too. There's a comment, and I think we already addressed this. It was, what is the timeline we're looking at just for you to actually start producing and testing drugs? And so there are clinical trials currently underway, both from the two programs that I had spoke about. There's more that we'll speak about at the meeting itself. And it says, are you looking to accomplish to make the disease dormant or try and eliminate the disease completely? I think we're all hopeful that we'd be able to completely wipe out homocystinuria. However, I don't think it's going to ever be that simple. I would love to think that one day we'll have gene therapy and it will do that, but I think we can't really know what's going to happen until it happens. Drug clinic, that this is why we have clinical trials. It's to really actually see what the drugs in development can do, what the therapies in development can do. And there's no way of really knowing. We've had very exciting data from both of the programs that I have mentioned. And so, we just have to wait and see. Both companies have published data. So if you're interested, we do have their most recent data readouts on our website, and you can also find them on their websites as well.
So I just want to say something. This is why these PFDD, EL-PFDD meetings are so important, because that question was, are we looking to make the disease more dormant, or actually, essentially cure or reverse the disease? Well, there might be things that are short of that, like helping with certain symptoms, or maybe just slowing the rate that the disease worsens. That would actually make a big important difference for you all, before something that is more curative or can make the disease fully dormant comes along. And so it's important for FDA and drug developers to know what your preferences are and what would be important and meaningful to you, because otherwise those studies might never get conducted in the first place. They might say, oh, this is too small of an effect we think this drug could have, when in reality, if they knew that would be meaningful to you, they would invest in that trial. And FDA, when they see the data, they wouldn't say, oh, this is just some modest effect. They'd say, this is an effect that's actually meaningful. So that's the kind of thing where your input can really help, expand the possible pipeline for HCU.
And I'll just say, it's our data also within those natural history studies can help contribute to this, and the data collection program. I know there's things that are in there that are even surprising to me as a patient who's pretty well connected. And so the more data we have to be able to share, the more patient experiences, the more they have to work with too. I know we're technically at time. There was a couple of questions that I wanted to get to, just because I think they're important. So one, I'll combine two of them. So it says, if I'm not symptomatic currently, is my voice still important? And can patients who have multiple conditions enroll in clinical trials? I know that's really two different questions, but I feel like they fit well together here just for where we're at.
Yeah. I can address.
I was going to say, Larry, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, sure. I'll start with the second part of it. So if you have another condition, that once again, it's going to depend. For every clinical trial, there's something called the inclusion criteria and the exclusion criteria. That means who will be included and what kind of things will they say. If you've got this condition, then you're not going to be included. So for instance, for some trials, if you have diabetes on top of the other underlying condition, you're not allowed to. Other times it doesn't make a difference. So you really have to go to each study. And like James mentioned earlier, talk to the investigators and mention to them, I've got this condition, would I still be allowed to be included? So it's on a case-by-case basis. And then the other part of the question was, if you're not actively having symptoms, if you had symptoms at another point in your life, yeah, we would like to hear about that. Or what are you doing? And What kind of treatments have you tried? Also, what are your hopes for the future or your worries about, is HCU going to stay like this with no symptoms? Or, am I worried all the time that I'm going to develop symptoms? So yes, your voice can be included as well.
Perfect. And then I'll tie the last two I have here together too. So if patients cannot participate, it says, if we can't participate in this event, can we participate in the HCU questions ahead of time? I'll go ahead and answer that one. Yes. So that is what the early comment period is. So go ahead and submit that early comment. There's the link I dropped into the chat. Scroll through there, and about halfway through, you'll see a blue box on the right side, and it has the questions on the left, and it says submit your comments early. That's where you'll see the list of questions. You'll be able to drop them in there. It's easier if you kind of take a question and respond individually or by symptom, I believe. So it just makes this easier to digest what you're submitting, so we don't get one long thing. Just know that if you do submit one long one, it's not all going to be connected in one piece. We'll have to break it up to make it applicable for where we're at when we bring the comments live. And the other thing is, I don't know how to answer this. So we do have international people who are participating in this meeting right now and who would like to participate the day of. Is there a way for the international members to call in, or what would you encourage them to do to have them be able to engage to the fullest extent?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're calling from outside the country, the country code for US is +1. So just add +1 in front of the number that you see at the top of your screen, and you'll be able to call us. You also will be able to submit written comments, via the internet on the day of the meeting or in advance. So.
And we'll make it really easy. So on the player page, you'll also see the comment section. We promise not to send you on a wild goose chase, so that way you can actually be present for the meeting. All right. Great. Wonderful. Will there be free phone calling for the number? I don't know what the number is, so no.
There will be no fees. Yes.
No fees?
No fees.
Okay. So no fees. That's good to know. All right. Well, thank you everyone for your time again this afternoon. We look forward to your participation on October 27th. We will be sending out a link to the recording, but we'll also include in there the link for the registration for the day of, and information on how to register, not register, to make your comments. But thank you so much for your time this afternoon. We really appreciate it, and we can't wait to share our experiences with the FDA on behalf of our community. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.